Hola, bona tarda a tothom. Bueno, lo primero, pediros disculpas porque precisamente no habíamos puesto los carteles de fila cero y entonces no sabíais, ¿no? que había esa fila cero. Muchas gracias a todas, a todes, a todos.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here this afternoon. And I think it is an afternoon, or it will be a beautiful afternoon. Well, that's the idea with which we have conceived this space, this seminar. We wanted to be a bit of a different seminar, different from what we always think of when we think of a seminar. First of all, of course, I would like to thank the CCCB for organizing this seminar within the Biennial of Thought. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of the small adjustments that have been necessary. I am seeing Mireia over there specifically, with whom we've been talking for weeks to imagine together this space. And of course, I would like to thank each and every one of you, the ones who are here this afternoon. And first, we're a bit nervous, aren't we? I have to acknowledge that to this day I still get nervous, but I think these are beautiful nerves. It's a good thing, precisely because today I think is a very important day. First, I will tell you about the structure we've thought of for this seminar with Dr. Oyewùmi. And then I will introduce Dr. Oyewùmi and the rest of participants in this seminar, in this panel that we have. The seminar is a long one, and it is from 4:30 to 8:30. We thought of organizing it in three separate blocks of 1 hour each, and in between we will have some time, an interlude with sound of approximately 20 minutes, so that we can have time for whatever we need to do, but also to place the body differently. It's important not to be here for 4 hours sitting down, hieratic. And these three blocks, the idea is for them to be three blocks that we can go through the thoughts of Dr. Oyewùmi in three different blocks. The first one would, and brought at the same time, the first one will be body. The second block will be, we will be talking about spirituality, and in the third one we will be talking about how we tackle the sense of the world. And well, without further ado, because we've used 15 minutes of the time we had, so I will introduce Dr. Oyewùmi. Dr. Oyèrónké, thank you very much for being here with us. Professor. She's a professor. In Spanish, we have a different word for that. It's a false friend. She's professor of sociology, gender studies, and African studies at the Stony Brook University. He received the Distinguished Africanist of the Society of African Studies in 2021, an acknowledgement given to a person who is a member of an association and has made extraordinary contributions in her field. And in her research and her writing, her academic writing, she focuses, of course, on gender, quote-unquote gender, race, colonialism, knowledge, culture, and globalization. And her book, one of her books, actually one of her first books, if I'm not mistaken, the invention of women, making an African sense of Western gender discourses, which was republished in Spanish by Dijous publisher last year in 2023, but her book originally is from 1997, if I'm not mistaken. 1997 is a key reference for African feminisms, of course, and first and foremost, also for feminisms in plural, also for decolonial feminisms in current times as well. And Dr. Oyewùmi studied at the Ibadan University, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Ibadan, in Nigeria, and the University of California, Berkeley, and she is the author of several publications, monographs, and several anthologies as well. She has gained many research fellowships, different awards, prizes, including, for example, the Rockefeller Fellowship and fellowships of the Ford Foundation grants. And if I'm not mistaken, again, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, her latest book is an anthology titled Naming Africans, on the epistemic value of African names. Yes? With Springer?
Yeah. In 2023.
In 2023.
Bueno, This year. Wow. Congrats. Thank you. It
is a true pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. Truly. I will continue to introduce the rest of the panelists of this seminar. Jaenabou Dembaga. She's a sociologist, African Catalan of Gambian descent. She's a guest editor for the magazine Contextos, and she's a member of the Umbrales UMA. And let me see if I can pronounce it correctly. Diabiji Soninke. Okay. And consultant to Barcelona Acción Intercultural and the Pere Tarrés Foundation. She works for social causes in the areas of anti-racism, Islamophobia, and feminism, and everything related to Afro-descendant and Black African communities in Catalonia, especially regarding spiritual matters and gender. Pleasure to have you here as well. And then we also have here with us Marisol Saelo. Marisol is an expert in gender violence intervention. Is a career civil servant with more than 10 years experience in caring for women who've survived gender violence. Her professional experience has focused on local social services in the areas of migration and equality. She's an activist linked with the Centro Cultural Espacio Afro in Madrid, and there we share some things. And she, amongst others, coordinated its first session, the first two sessions on the immigrant, racialized women and gender violence workshops held at the Espacio Afro. And she's also the person in charge of the volunteer area of the project. And she's tired because this last weekend we had a festival, our annual festival, and Marisol has a huge task there. Thank you very much, Marisol. And I should introduce myself, shouldn't I? Let's see if I find something about myself to introduce myself. Don't laugh. I never know what to say about myself. My name is Esther Mayoko Ortega. I always like to say it in this order. I am an activist, researcher, teacher. Yes, I'm a PhD in philosophy of science, master's in feminist theory. I'm reading it literally from the bio. And I have a degree in history. Yes, all of that is true. I currently work for the university programs of Spain, Middlebury College as well, here in Spain, and in several postgraduate degrees and university masters, the most recent one in the Vic University. And yes, I'm an Afro-feminist activist of the sexual dissidents, and I've been activating Afro-centered Afro-feminist thought for a few years now, first from Conciencia Afro in Madrid, and for about a year now, if you don't know, I moved to Barcelona, and I'm participating in a project called La Casita Ediciones, and we collaborated in the organization together with the CCCB in the organization of this seminar, which is a space of critical interventions in publishing and cultural policies with a Black feminist perspective. And I am in charge of curating. I like to use the word curating this seminar. And then there are many more things in my CV, but it's not necessary. I don't need to say much more because it's almost 5 p.m. I think without further ado, we will go straight to the first of the 3 blocks that we had conceived and proposed to work on, to reflect. As I said, we would like for this to be a bit flexible, a bit of a flexible seminar. We didn't want it to be we did not want this to look like a lecture, nothing like that. We wanted to have a conversation, especially a shared conversation, communal conversation. In this row 0, there are several collectives who work mainly in Catalonia, Afro-feminist collectives and collectives from the Afro diaspora in general, and for whom Dr. Oyewùmi's work has been and is a key point of reference. So without further ado, it will be very nice to hear everything you have to say, brothers and sisters, in this row zero, and we would like to make you a part of this. We would like for you to participate and for this to really become a beautiful afternoon of conversations, communal conversations. So let's start with the first block, which would be, well, we are going to be opening up big topics from the very beginning. We thought first to talk about the body. The body in the Western world has been and continues to be a privileged space on which, and I'm going to use air quotes, on which differences have been visualized and inscribed. Differences are marked on the body. And these differences that have marked a way of seeing the world and a social division, of course, have done so mainly in terms of gender and race. These will be the two categories that are inscribed in the body, amongst others, but two main categories that, let's say, from the Western way of thinking are inscribed in the body. But what happens when or if the body is not understood as that place of inscription of the differences through the visualization of it? But as Dr. Oyewùmi proposes in her interpretation of social order in a traditional Yoruba society, what if the body is conceived in a different manner, in a more extensive manner, not as an individual body, and also in a sense which is trans-temporary? The body is not single, it's not unique, it's not one. So I'm asking, what would happen with that? Dr. Oyewùmi also makes us think in the specific case of the Yoruba society on how, or what was the impact of the colonial imposition of these categories associated to the body on the Yoruba society. And she also makes us wonder, and she herself wondered in her work more than 25 years ago already, and I'm sure she continues to wonder and she continues to update it. What are the positions of the so-called Yoruba men and women in a new society arising from European colonization, or starting from European colonization of this territory? These are some questions that are related to the body, to gender, and I would love for us to be able to reflect upon them collectively, to think about them together. I'm especially interested in how we can, or how we are doing it, because I understand we're doing it in a way, in a sense. How can we try and flee from, if you want to put it that way, flee from these inscriptions of the body, escape these inscriptions of the body or even on the body? How can we escape those visualization exercises that the Western system, white supremacy, has imposed on the way we are seen, the way we are read, and also what have been the effects, the impacts of that on us, on ourselves. So how we today, we read ourselves based on that, through that lens. How do we see our own bodies and how we do those exercises, because we are carrying out those exercises, as I said, of escaping the body in a way. And I would like to pose a question, and we talked about this before we started with Day and with Marisol. And I would like to pose a question of, it's a light question. What is the gender of Blackness in this territory? What is the gender of negritude? Okay, so I will be silent now and we will open the conversation. I proposed some ideas, but of course, I like to throw questions in the air, but I don't have many answers, so.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here and to see you all gathered. I hope we have a very, very productive session. And I already feel it from Mayoko's question that I may not be able to answer, but it should get us going. So your first question is, what is the gender of Blackness?
Wow.
Did you say that?
Yeah, but no, it's not my first question. It's a question I always is surrounding me, you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the immediate thing I would immediately raise is, of course, Blackness where? Context. Context is always important. And perhaps I digress, but perhaps it illuminates what I'm going to say, illuminates something. Somebody asked me that question that I see people asking celebrities or anybody today. They would say things that if you had to talk to your younger self, what would you say? What would you have said to your maybe 23-year-old self? And I thought about it, and when I left Nigeria around that age, and it occurred to me that looking back now, if I were to talk to my 23-year-old self, I would have said that I didn't realize how racist the world was because I grew up in Nigeria. And one of the ways in which this manifests in the way I talk about my experiences in the US, or Chimamanda Adichie too has talked about it, is that so many of us Africans, West Africans, Nigerians, we say that we didn't know we were Black until we got to the US. And quite a number of people, especially African Americans, they are not too happy to hear us say that. And they're not happy. It's almost as if, why were you so not conscious? you know? What? But for me, I was a student of colonialism. That's why I went to do a PhD. So I knew about race, but I didn't grow up looking in the mirror and saying, oh, I'm Black. It didn't make sense in our setting. In a country of over 100 million people now, we're saying Nigeria is 200 million, in which Black just didn't make sense then. So when I bring back that question of what's the gender of black? In fact, I think we can complicate it and say to a Nigerian or to me at 23, what is the race of black? Not just gender. What is the race of blackness? What was the race of blackness? But things have changed now. I wouldn't expect anybody in Nigeria or anywhere in the world not to have heard about race or to experience that racialization that I didn't experience until I got to the US. So even if you're living in the remotest village in any part of the world today, many people tend to experience racialization and racism through the media, through television. You're going to see the Kardashians. You're going to see who is acceptable as beautiful. You're going to see women of all colors must have hair that is up to their butts, right? And all that. So today, because of globalization, so many things have been globalized. Gender, blackness, racism, notions of beauty. And so indeed, it does invite that question about what is the race of blackness? What is the gender of blackness? And the role of racism still in continuing to structure the world and even our personal experiences.
A mí me gustaría que esto fuese una conversación.
I would like for this to be a conversation, a shared conversation. So,
Gracias,
thank you,
doctora Oyewùmi, también,
Dr. Oyewùmi, also because,
o sea, esta
I mean,
reflexión
this
es muy útil, ¿no?
reflection is very useful.
Años atrás, cuando yo
Years
salí de
ago,
Nigeria,
when I left Nigeria, you were saying,
no sabía, ¿no?
I didn't know
No sabía qué era de eso de
that
ser negro.
what was this thing about being
Claro,
black.
ser negro es una
Being black
categoría
is a
que
category
solo tiene
that
sentido
only makes
en
sense
contacto con,
in contact with,
en contacto
in
con,
contact
o
with,
en un mundo
or in a world
que no es el mundo,
which is not,
en este caso, por ejemplo,
in this case, for example, in
está poniendo
which
el
is not
ejemplo.
Nigeria, as the example you gave us.
Claro,
So
allí la gente
there,
no es negra,
people are not
o quizá
black,
a día de hoy
or
sí,
maybe
pero
as of today,
no,
yes.
en un contexto
But
local,
in a
la
local
gente en el continente
context,
africano
in the African
era
continent,
tipo,
people
Wolof,
will be Iko, Wolof, Boogie, Soninke,
X, Y, o
X,
Z,
Y, Z.
pero no seremos
But
allí, no seremos
there,
negros.
we will not be black.
Negros es era negra,
Black,
persona negra, es esa
being
categoría
a
que
black
solo,
person is that
en
category
contacto con
that
¿no? Con
comes
la
about
blanquitud,
when you're in
con
contact with
Occidente,
whiteness, with the Western
somos,
world.
A partir de ese momento,
From that moment,
somos esa categoría.
we become that category.
Pero es muy interesante,
But it's very
plantea
interesting
que
what you were
quizá
just
a día de
saying,
hoy,
that
¿no?
maybe
Precisamente por el
as of
efecto de la
today,
globalización,
precisely because of
ahora sí podríamos
globalization,
entender, ¿no?
now we would be able to
Que
understand
somos negros
that
globalmente
we
también, da un
are
poco
black
de,
globally as
¿no?
well.
Me gustaría seguir pensando
I would like to continue
que en
thinking
el continente
that in the
es una
continent,
categoría
it is a
que no
category
funciona.
that doesn't work.
Me gustaría
I would
pensar
like
que
to
es una
think
categoría que
that
no
it is a
funciona,
category that
pero
doesn't
temo que
work there,
en gran
doesn't
medida
function.
lleva
But
usted
I think
razón,
to a great
que a
extent
día de
you're
hoy,
right, as of
precisamente por los
today,
efectos de la
precisely because
globalización,
of the effects of
eh,
globalization,
la negritud, ¿no? Ser
blackness,
negro, negra,
negritude, being
es,
black,
es algo que
is
atraviesa.
something that
Hermanas,
is all around you. Sisters,
La pregunta
The question you pose about the gender, you can talk about something else if you want. You don't need to be stressed about my questions. We can talk about whatever you want, really. Don't give me that face. No. Okay, let's see. I would like to talk mainly, or this reflection that you made is very timely and adequate to be able to understand also. In this case, I talk from my position as a Soninke woman and how Soninke women experience this racialization and these categories, these binary categories of gender here in Catalonia. But before talking about that, I think it is important to be able to talk with these pre-existing categories. I think first we should talk about misogynoir. For those of you who are not familiar with misogynoir, it's a term that is used and that was coined by Moya Bailey to describe intersection between misogyny and racism, especially against Black women. Misogynoir recognizes that Black women are faced with a unique form of oppression that combines contempt for the gender and dehumanization of racialization. And these manifests in different areas such as the media and other areas as well. And this is very important because this is a conversation that we Soninkes have. It is a conversation that we have at an intergenerational level. Our parents did not know they were Black until they got here because they were in contact with whiteness, with the system that oppresses them. They came in contact with that system that makes them see they are Black. So us, we, as sons and daughters of Ouagadougou, I like to say Ouagadougou because for some of us they know us as sons and daughters of the Degas Empire, but we ourselves say we are the sons and daughters of Ouagadougou. So I'll say this throughout the seminar, and I just wanted to explain it so you can understand. This is a debate that we have, and we must have it. Racism is real, is tangible. It's not an imagination, something that people imagine. Oh, they are always complaining. No. Misogynoir is real. It has an impact in how we are stereotyped, in how we are perceived. And especially here in Catalonia, we can see it through protocols like the female genital mutilation protocol. I'm starting to criticize already. I'll cut straight to the chase, and how this racialization and these, as Fanon said, the not being, the zone of not being has an impact on Afro-descendant populations and the diaspora, and how the application of these protocols, such as the genital mutilation protocol, forced marriage, and the notion that people have of polygamy also have a negative impact on how we are perceived from whiteness, of how whiteness sees us, and even the relationships we may have between the different Afro-descendant populations. If I am digressing, you can tell me, but I think this is also a place to talk about these types of elements, to put them on the table. And if you allow me to continue for a little bit longer, in this case, on how the applicability, I want to make a comment. I want to give an example of female genital mutilation because it's a clear example of how the applicability of this is misogynoir. It racializes childhood, it re-stigmatizes. Girls are not girls, they are just Black girls. and they are aware of that process since childhood and how this generates dynamics of suspicion in the community, how the body, which is the central axis of the seminar, how the body of Afro-descendant persons of the diaspora specifically, or how our body is not completely ours with this applicability of these protocols. I also wanted to pass the floor over to Marisol, but I wanted to, in the seminar, I wanted for the colleagues on row 0 to be able to participate in the debate, because it's a very serious debate and it has devastating effects. And even more so, it has led the public administration to review the protocols. They felt compelled to review the protocols, how the dehumanization of the bodies of Afro-descendant persons and African persons who live here in Catalonia affected by this misogynoir and this racialization. And do not give me more time because I will use it.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todas, a todos.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here this afternoon sharing with us. I'm extremely happy to be here with the doctor. I'm feeling less and less nervous. And let's move on to the body. And by the way, and talking about the body, misogynoir and blackness, I think it's important, as Bubi woman, it is true that the presentation did not state that. Bubi, and Bubi culture is one of the ethnicities in Equatorial Guinea. We know the relationship it has with Spain. And also the drift colonialism has had, and in the end, black women, daughters of this colonialism, me being a daughter of, I think, what is the meaning for me to be black in the Spanish state? So what does it mean to me? It means that when I'm made to realize that I'm black, I'm feeling the other, the otherness, the different. The universalization of gender takes for bodies and violences suffered by black bodies to be made invisible somehow in the end. And she was talking about female genital mutilation, but we could transpose this to all sexual violences or sexist violences, because we do have a very ambitious law here in the Spanish state, and reviewable, of course, 20 years later. But at the end of the day, the part of racialization and racism is frequently ignored. And this means that on my day-to-day, women I listen to, women survivors, I ask them if they've suffered from racism, and almost all, and I would dare to say almost 90%, they say yes. The majority of women, also in the narrative they talk about, inter-ethnic relationships, attacks, is go back to your country, please be sent to your country, I sent you back to your country, in a racist context. And it's true that research perhaps do not apply on these, and it's not tackled because those things that you don't mention don't exist. It's very easy to say, but at the end of the day, black women continue to suffer from racism. Afro-descendants are told we exaggerate all the time. No, but you're my friend, this doesn't happen to you. That's what they say. But, well, row 0 can speak about what our day-to-day is, and and how important it is the way we are represented and how we've been historically represented. I insist on the fact that we went from being savages of dehumanization to subalterns when we start having a bit of training and being able to speak. We're not given the space or the places. And thanks to La Casita for promoting this type of meetings and gatherings so that our voices can be heard as well. And so, well, the importance of the place, as Jamila Rivero is saying, those places that actually talk about reality are also very important, because if we're always looking at or hearing the same voices, not the same realities are being heard, of course. Should I continue or should we give the floor? Because I'm not nervous anymore. I could keep on talking forever. Okay, well, anyway, if there's someone in row 0 wanting to mention or say something, but this imaginary of the construct of the Black woman throughout history makes us vulnerable, and it continues to do so, and the system is not providing any answers to us, but it doesn't allow us to have that space to provide proposals in order to get these answers, and that's the end for me. Apologies, but she needs to use the microphone for us to translate, please. But we're not getting any sound in the translation booth. Apologies. Can you hear me now? Okay. So, I'm nervous with a microphone now. Okay. I have several questions. While I was listening to you, they came up, and the first question I have is related to misogynoir and also fetishism, because oftentimes I feel that when we talk about gender violence against Black women, we're not only the otherness, but also an exotic object to exhibit, only for starters. And I'm reminded of novels such as Ken Bubul's Crazy Baobab, or how French colonialism imposed the population in Senegal for their ancestors being callous. Well, she believed that her ancestors were French, and she got to Belgium and she realized she was Black, apart from living a lot of violence, sexual attacks, gender violence, and that's when she realized that her body was being used as a fetish. So dehumanization reaches many faraway places, even your bed. It gets into your bed. And in the end, your body, because of the Blackness itself, or not only because of Blackness itself, but also because of the Afro identity, is made exotic. So it's fetish, and not only that, but you're not deserving of dignity, love, or respect. And this also reminds me of, what's the name of the novel? Can't remember now. I can send the title to La Casita later, but it's very popular in Senegal. A person who lives in a town and speaks to, well, they want to build a school in the village, and the dad of the boy is sort of the leader of the town, and in the end they even sees the spirituality of the place, and the entire experience is told as a fetishism, and also that of the Black men. And also my second question, sorry, I'm not being too organized with my questions, but anyway, when you're a victim of sexual violence and gender violence, and it's not just only being attacked for the fact of it being a woman, but if you've had psychological violence such as colorism, you're not light enough, your hair is not straight enough, and you say that's gender violence, and they deny that's gender violence at all. So how could we appeal or call upon the institutions who are trying to get rid of gender violence to have misogynoir taken into account so that it could cover all the victims that actually do report what's happening to them? Thank you. Thank you, firstly, for giving us this space and for the approach. Thank you, Doctor, for all your knowledge and how important it is for many of us. When we speak about the body, in this conversation we have started, I think about this question of the stagnant categorization in a way, and going back to the gender of blackness, because I always believe that blackness has no gender, because somehow, as Jaenabou was saying, and Marisol also mentioned the invisibility, well, one category ends up eating another one in our bodies. So, in a way, our gender is somewhat left to our blackness because we're always black before being woman. So, like Isetun was saying now, when you report or point out some specific violences or specific racialized gender violence, as in this case, this attack to your appearance, looks, your professionalism even, depending on your looks and appearance and how you express that African nature and how you show yourself, your respectability and professionalism is affected by it. So in a way, I do feel that these categories do not, in practice, operate in a cross-cutting way, but rather one is hiding up the other. Blackness, in a way, always imposes itself in this socialization our bodies do in these white environments. So when the doctor was talking about this awareness of blackness when leaving the continent, I was reminded of one of the first papers I wrote. As I was telling Desi, an Afrofeminist, quote, "You're not born black, you are made black." So you are not black because you're an African, you're not black until you are in contact with that, not otherness, but rather the being that makes you the other. So in my case, we have this small campaign in the community that makes us think about when we realize that we are actually black women and black men, and it made me think about this. It happened to me when I was 4, when I went to school. This was the first time I was aware of that blackness. Up to that moment, I was just a girl in her home with a family, and I was just a girl, only that. But when I started socializing with other girls and boys, they started asking why my skin was as it was and my hair, and why are you black? So not only I realized that I was a black girl, but I was a girl black. We should sort of change the order of the words. So I'm very thankful for all your reflections, and it's very important to take all these concepts and conceptualizations into account when we say that race is a social construct. It also has an effect on the way we are all aware or not aware of that construction within our own or through our own bodies. I would like to add, just to fill in what she was saying, when the doctor realized that she realizes she's a black person when she leaves Nigeria. Here, the experience that we have, the Afro-descendant persons have here, that we are born and grow in mostly white environments, it's that moment when you stand out from a group, and you're pointed out, but not as you feel guilty, and you start with a series of psychological issues and emotional issues that we also need to bear in mind. So we should go into matters related to mental health and how all this has an effect on us all. And I was also thinking about that mixture or combination that takes place in situations when, in moments like this, with a call, with an event, we are the only Black bodies in those places where we are. So in a cafe, university, class, or restaurant. And there's this very weird dichotomy, because I feel that while being the only person in those spaces on some specific moments, this makes us non-anonymous, if you know what I mean. So it is a bit of a trick to think that, because at the same time we're very invisible. So perhaps I'm leaving the body and going more towards emotions and the mind, but at the end of the day this is all shown through the body. So I would like to launch all these reflections. So being read as a Black person in a context where Blackness is something negative, and how this has an impact in our emotions, and at the end of the day it is transmitted through the body.
Hola, me llamo Jennifer.
Hello, my name is Jennifer. Thank you so much. All your thoughts are so interesting, and I just wanted to talk about an opinion I have on this issue of body and race, gender, body and race, because for some time now I've been thinking a lot about this intersection and these binary gender impositions, and how have they affected race, because Black people or racialized people as being non-white, we are not classified into these categories. So for me, just to tell you about my story, I'm a Black person who was born here in Europe, in Spain, and therefore, as Desiree was saying, I've always been in these mostly white contexts, and you're the Black person there. Because, yes, Blackness cannot be understood in the same way. We need to look at the context, because a Black person born here may go to an African country and is not seen as a Black person or read as such. So it's interesting to see how this racialization, well, what is the race of Blackness, as the doctor was saying? This is also interesting when you're traveling abroad. But anyway, this is a totally different thing. What I wanted to say, I don't want to beat around the bush, but many times Black girls are girls Black, as she was saying, or they're not even perceived as girls, because we are in some places that are more of a male nature places, or there's masculinities, or I can't really explain it, but we are made masculine because we are treated a bit like beasts, and this happens to us as girls in Europe. But Esther, one of your questions or reflections is, how can we escape? I don't know the words you used, but how can we create new ways of thinking about ourselves? I think that trans, either for Anti-racism is essential for trans, of course, because it was colonialism imposing these gender categories. But for anti-racism, for Black people, all trans-related issues are very important because the existence of trans people or gender diversities, this is what makes us think, I am cis, why am I cis, and what does this all mean? And it makes us rethink on all gender categories and racialization as well. And I consider we should be, or we need to incorporate and include the theories, or at least take them into account at all times, whether we are or not queer people. But as racialized people, it's important to have queer and trans be part of our fights, because we are not in those gender categories. I'm thinking a lot about the reflection on something that seems very obvious, but I do believe it's important, or at least for the people who come from the Caribbean, it is important to distinguish between black or blackness. Because when this category is established, I'm not going to say this in French. When this is politicized at the end of the 60s, it is precisely to group all these bodies, stories, spiritualities that have been fragmented. So for me, it is important to carry out a distinction that seems obvious and is related to what we are reflecting about now. One thing is how Western Europe names us and how the white world calls us, and how we are creating these categories and reflections in the different communities to emancipate what the white is denying us. So it was important to talk about the history of how blackness is becoming a position, a place of emancipation in a way, and imagination as well, in terms of going beyond the logics of what the owner established. This seems very obvious, but I had this gut feeling while listening to you, because this is a word that in the Caribbean has allowed us to somehow reposition ourselves and to question these modern colonial terms and concepts that we know. I also wanted to ask a favor. I was talking about epigenetics and mental health, and as a great therapist, could you please share with us in this space the idea of this scientific evidence and how it affects us in community health? Perhaps not right now, but this is something that lies in the very foundation of the conversation. Everything that we're saying here does resonate. Thank you for asking the question. I might think about it and provide an answer later. I have the microphone back, so I'll use it if you allow me. At first, it's hard, but once you get it, I don't know, doctor, but I would like to hear you elaborate further about. Well, I was thinking how we can all link all this to that very deep reflection on what happened with the Yoruba and all the cosmogony and how it's all rethought. If there's something that has allowed us, and I'm talking about a Caribbean perspective here, ancestral technologies and these ways of preserving the ontologies, the knowledge, Yoruba things occupy a very important thing. Voodoo in the Dominican and Haitian places. These are places where we've been able to rethink. I can't even pronounce it now, but genderizing our bodies, too much. I would like to know a bit more about these bodies, Yoruba, spiritualness of it all.
Bueno, si quiere ir la doctora primero.
Sí, esto último que ha planteado Janet, que era...
Okay, what Janet was mentioning now, which was a direct question, basically, I was going to say that, well, perhaps Dr. Oyewùmi wants to answer now because it was a direct question, but we have the entire second block and we actually want to talk about spirituality. So, Doctor, it's really up to you. You decide when.
Well, maybe we should do that under spirituality. Or are we done with the body? Or how separate is it?
Okay. Entonces, podemos quizá...
Okay, so then perhaps we can continue. There was a couple of hands raised. Gisette? Yes, yeah, you have the microphone. I hadn't seen.
Hi, soy Gisette.
My name is Gisette, and I'm Afro-Venezuelan, and I share Janet's reflection on how our bodies, well, I experienced the exact same thing as Dr. Oyewùmi. When I migrated, I did realize I was Black because my identity, my atmosphere and environment in Venezuela was always around my own family, and my family is quite huge. So there were many of us, many Black people, and I'd never realized how much it mattered in socialization. And then at the same time, I realized the amount of violence racialized bodies suffer in the Caribbean, and it was by being here that I realized it all. But I wanted to share that Caribbean bodies also have this exotic load or weight, which is fairly complex and is part of our culture. I grew up dancing salsa with all my aunts and uncles and going from one gentleman to the next. But then when you arrive here, you realize that socialization in Spain, the culture regarding dance, partying is absolutely different. And many different violences on our bodies are fed in a way. And I also wanted to launch this reflection, and these Caribbean bodies experience this a bit more because perhaps we're more, we like to touch each other. I don't know, we like to grab other people when we dance, and sometimes the limits are... well, we do suffer from many terrible things because of that.
Hello. Hi. My name is Shikemi, and I'm not gonna go too much into my own experiences with it because rough. My family is Yoruba, but I was born in England and I grew up in Germany, in northern Germany. So, yeah, not too much to say about it. But from this experience of oftentimes, in my high school, there was 1,000 children, and I was the only Black person there. Yeah, I know, double rough. From the experiences of these times and also living in Denmark later, I think it's important to talk about the body, but equally, I think it very much expands the body. I think its behavior, its expression, its style, its sexuality. Because if we talk about the socialization that led to this, we also need to talk about the social category, which I think rather than talking about Black woman, it's Black femininity. And this categorization was obviously made to not just oppose white femininity, but also to oppose masculinity in general. That is to have a scale, to have a reference for their greatness, for this ideal. And I think this is something that started even before the times of like human zoos, for example, where this was also very present, right? They went there to feel good about themselves, to be like, look, these are the others, this is us. And those same like zoological violences and that animality and exoticism is very much what defined the later social category of Black femininity. And because it is a social category, anybody can embody it. That means anybody can benefit from it, which is, for example, what the doctor had said earlier about the Kardashians or people using blackface or using the positive aspects. And at the same time, anyone can bear the downsides from it, which is why we, for example, see Black trans women as some of the most marginalized and victimized people, beyond even just talking about Black women in general, which I don't even like because it's also just very cis and very whatever. But so I think talking about Black femininity, the expectations of Black femininity, the social category of it is more valuable than talking about the body. And also about what was said earlier about maybe being the only Black person in a room full of whiteness, which I can very much relate to, and being invisible, but at the same time being exposed. I think it's interesting to note that we are invisible as long as we are adhering to the category of that Black femininity. Because when you start breaking out of it in one way or another, in your Blackness, in your femininity, in your expression of gender or anything, that's when you start to become visible in a very uncomfortable way. So I think that was all the comments were amazing. Everyone's making great thoughts. Yeah. But yeah, that's just what I wanted to add.
Sí, pero con el micro.
Yes, I apologize, the microphone. We have another 10 minutes, but because we started this block at 5, so... But we're already late, I'm telling you. So if you want, we can close. There was someone else? Oh, there was someone else. Sorry. I hadn't seen you. Sorry. I apologize. Well, then go ahead. And then after this last comment, if that's okay with you, we can close this block. We will continue the conversation with some of the things that have been discussed, and we will have the first break, the first rest break. Okay.
It's kind of an extension on some of the points that have been made before, but I think if my question is, as black people, whatever that is, if we accept that the category of Blackness is in opposition to something else and it's there to keep us on the margins, feeling bad about ourselves, might we want to consider rejecting even asking ourselves these questions? Right? Why are we so obsessed with identifying ourselves in relation to people that are in the minority and, by the way, kind of making their decline? I'm being a little bit mischievous here, but it's also a really serious question because sometimes it feels like we're spending a whole load of energy justifying our existence rather than celebrating our fantasticness. So if we want to talk about the body, yes, we've got sexual and gender-based violence, we've got everything that we know about, as do other populations in the world. But we also have these technologies that were spoken about that we have used and continue to use to allow us not only to survive and thrive. And so I'm interested in thinking about the body as like our expression of our wonderfulness. That's where I feel, and I've worked around sexual and gender-based violence for about 25 years. I feel more and more that we need to be celebrating, tweaking, doing more with what we can already do, like being in community, having fun together, dancing together, eating together, laughing together. That's more of the embodied experiences that I feel are valuable areas for us to examine more. And I'm not by any stretch of the imagination undermining the effects of racial weathering and all the ways that we are kind of suffering. But the flip side of that is we've always found ways, in spite of everything, to be fabulous. And I kind of feel a bit like the world has something to learn from us, whoever us is, around that more so. And so at this stage in my life, I'm about halfway through my life, I hope, that's where I want to be putting more energy. What is it about what we do in embodied ways that allows us not only to survive this, whatever, the Babylon, but what actually allows us to thrive? And can we make more of and do more with that? So that's kind of a question for all of us.
Good question.
Os cedo la palabra, quedarían...
We have approximately 8 minutes, and I'll pass the floor over to you, whoever wants to say something maybe specific. You have something specific to say.
Yeah, I appreciate all your comments and questions from different directions. And I especially appreciate the last speaker. What's your name? Awa. Because one of the things that I have been grappling with in the diaspora is this idea that the category Black supersedes Africa. I don't like it. We can debate why, but part of it has to do with some of what Awa was alluding to. Because whenever we talk about Black and put Blackness in, unfortunately, we sort of center whiteness, because Black is defined in relation to white. And people have done a lot of work and continue to do Black power and Black and proud. I don't want to take anything away from that. But as an African, I do not see why we should leave Africa and enthrone Black as a way of defining whatever we're defining. Because Africa is bigger, broader, bigger than the body, bigger than everything. And Africa is the origin of humanity. And I think that in invoking Africa as a place, as a category, as a way of seeing ourselves, it opens up more possibilities about celebration, creativity, dance, invention, and all that. Because whenever you really interrogate Africa, I'm Black, you have to go back to so much of the oppression. However, I am also aware that it's also a matter of context, because you cannot be in Babylon or in the belly of the beasts and not be so aware of how blackness is used and all. But I think that it's important to also focus on Africa. And I like African descendants, because that's part of what you're doing is invoking a place, a space, which was always the argument that was made in the United States, right? When instead of saying Black Americans, people decided to be African American. But you know what? From research, I'm told that many African Americans prefer to be Black Americans. So it's complicated, but I think we have to put it on the table, and it's about context. But it's important, as Awa just told us, we should also think about the ways in which we've always been fabulous. Africans invented the human, and whoever invented the human invented God. You know? So a whole lot of things that, that living things are about. It's about Africa. And we mustn't forget that, even as we acknowledge the category Black. Thank you.
Bueno, yo creo que paramos.
Well, I think that we can stop here. And, or, yes, can we stop now? Yes, yes. I saw you with the mic in your hand. Okay, so we'll stop now. We will have our first break, and I will shorten it a little bit so that we can make up for lost time. It will be a 15-minute break instead of 20. So in 15 minutes, we will be back here. Okay? At 6 and 13 minutes exactly. 13 past 6.
Bueno, parece que ya estamos, así que vamos a seguir.
Okay, we shall continue. Did you have an opportunity to get some rest? Did you like the musical interlude? The musical interlude is not, it's an interlude, but it also helps us to continue thinking and putting our bodies in this seminar, bringing our bodies to the seminar. It's these other ways of talking, communicating through these sound memory, especially the sound memory of the continent. And let us begin with the second block that is related to spirituality as a general framework. Some things were already said. I'm thinking about the question Jeanette posed, precisely related to the previous block. She talked about spirituality matters and the importance of things related to spirituality, and specifically Yoruba spirituality in the Caribbean, all of this heritage in the Caribbean. Okay, so in her book, The Invention of Women, Dr. Oyewùmi talks to us about Yoruba spirituality, which, just like other aspects of social life, was not marked by gender before the introduction of Christianity or Islam in the Yoruba land. The androcentric reinterpretation of this Yoruba spirituality affected the three main pillars: Olodumare, the higher being. I placed an article there. In Spanish, I used the article. It almost escaped me to use the masculine. It almost slipped my tongue and used the masculine article. Orishas, messenger gods of this supreme being, and family, ancestrality or lineage. These would be the three main pillars. And starting with the contact and assimilation with missionaries and Christian theologies, these three pillars became human shapes ascribed to a Western gender, a determined Western gender. Like I did before, I almost used the male article, masculine or feminine. At the same time, the introduction of Christianity led to the attempt to abolish polygamy in the Yoruba society. But interestingly, for this abolition of polygamy, they focused solely on giving up what they at the time called Yoruba men gave it up without women playing a role or having a say in this reconfiguration of not only the moral order but the social order as well. Dr. Oyewùmi talked about how this new social position that these other wives would take and their descendants, how the social reconfiguration impacted, or she tells us about how it impacted the basic lineage structures of the Yoruba social organization in this case. And in this block, I also wanted for us to talk about these ways in which the imposition of patriarchal Christian colonization was imposed over other African cultures. For example, Marisol is here. I don't know if she wants to tell us a bit about it, or other of our sisters who are here as well, who belong to the Bubi culture of what today is colonially called Equatorial Guinea, which is a culture, society in which lineage is matrilineal and the social structure is matrilocal. So I wanted to ask myself, do we nowadays live in societies which are dual, in which different cultural elements come into play, the cultural elements of our specific African cultures? And I think here we should also introduce a notion of the African diaspora, because I think there are elements, cultural elements, that are already common to the Afro diaspora as such. I'm thinking again of the Caribbean, just to give you an example. So, in these dual societies, how do all of these elements combine? All of these elements, some of which are own, some of which are Western. What could be the meaning of what we've called in Spanish mestizaje? In terms of spirituality, African spirituality and spirituality of the Afro diaspora as well. So I always have more questions than anything else, but here I'm interested in both Jay and of course Dr. Oyewùmi, but both Jay and Marisol, who grew up in an environment, in a culture such as the Bubi culture, or in an environment such as the Soninke culture, where spirituality is important and is differential to the experience of living in this territory. So maybe I would like for you to, as we say, take the floor and take your time and explain and tell us, But we're also open to incorporating other voices, and I wouldn't like to forget about the question posed by Janet, which was left open in the first block. Who would like to open fire? Dr. Oyewùmi, you have the floor.
I have the floor. And I don't have dance steps. Well, in a circuitous way of talking about spirituality, especially in Yoruba society, one of the things that have preoccupied me on this whole question of gender and the fact that Yoruba society, when we look at the institution categories, until recently, there were no gender markers, right? And one of the questions that I continue to ask that preoccupies me and other people haven't been able to answer is that why were Yoruba people able to get away from this thing called gender that looks so, in the West, that is so big and whatever. So on the one hand, I'm talking about the society, non-genderness of the society. But Yoruba society was spiritual. Spirituality is everywhere, right? In the way in which people saw and defined themselves. And lately, these questions have come to the fore. I may not have answers, but these are the ways I'm thinking about it. As a result of the trans movement, transgender movement, queer movement, I see people inviting me to come and present my work, and I see quite a number of trans people finding, should I say, legitimacy in the way in which I have described Yoruba society. And so people ask me questions. But what is interesting here then is that in Yoruba society, the categories that the non-gendered categories that I have presented, that we use in our everyday life, the reason why those categories work is because they are part of the collective community, not in an individual. You can't be trans by yourself in terms of the fact that it is indeed in the community that these categories work. If you say, this is my senior sibling, or this is my junior sibling, it's relational. Yoruba categories are relational. Unlike brother, sister, which are embodied categories. So in a certain sense, I have to ask the question, because despite the fact that people have transitioned, they've become trans and all, it still hasn't changed the way society is operating. In Western society, even with trans, especially Black women, Black trans women, there's more violence against them than any other group in the United States. You have to wonder. So it left me with the question of, what is it then that confers categories? It's not an individual thing. In old Yoruba society, it was the collective that recognized you. But in this modern setting, because of individuality and individualism, these categories are based, they're embodied, based on one body. And gender identity is not social in the first instance, the way I have come to understand it. Because people tell you, you have to recognize somebody. If they say, this is how I am feeling from the inside, you're not going to question it. You have to accept it. So there's something very, very individual about the way in which the trans discourse has evolved. And that shouldn't surprise us, coming from a society in which gender is a binary and all that. But even as I talk about the collective and the way in which the collective, it is out of the collective that people identify themselves and see themselves, when you go into Yoruba spirituality, there's a concept of the individual. Individuality, probably, rather than individualism. So one of the main concepts in Yoruba that I particularly appreciate is the concept of Ori, which is the individual. Each of us have Ori. Ori literally means head, but Ori also, or maybe in the first instance, is what they call the inner head. And it's related to destiny. And so the idea is that in Yoruba society, because before each and every one of us is born, we kneel down before the Creator and choose our Ori. That's our destiny, meaning we choose what will happen to us on earth. And Ori is non-gendered. Everybody has an Ori. And Ori is in fact, Ori is the main article or factor of spirituality. Because in Yoruba, they always say, Ori is an Orisha. And Ori is the first amongst equals. Ori is ahead of other Orisha. Because it is said in Yoruba that there's nothing that any other Orisha, the divinities, whether it's Oshun, Shango, can give you without your Ori allowing it first. So Ori is all important. And it's a source of identity. And part of what I see that the concept really holds is that everything starts with you. You cannot then give your Ori to some pastor or imam. You have to start with yourself. You have to center yourself. And I believe that the concept of Ori and Yoruba spirituality, if we think about it and reflect upon it further, it probably will provide answers to why and how you can create a society in which you don't talk about gender and this and that. That you have to start with Uri. Uri is not gender specific. It's about destiny. It's about the choice. Another reason why Uri is important is that you choose your Uri before you come into Earth. That's how we understand it. And part of what I do in my other book, What Gender is Motherhood, is that I explicated what I learned about Ori from Ifa, divination and all that. I explicated it further that one of the things you do when you choose your Ori, because nobody comes to the earthly space without choosing an Ori. That's a process, part of the process of coming to Earth. Maybe people want to say part of the process of becoming embodied. Nobody comes to this space without choosing your Ori. And one of the things that one does then in that process of choosing Ori is to choose a mother. Choosing Ori is about choosing a mother, the mother that will bring you to Earth. So the understanding is that children choose mothers. And so I went on, as I talked about mother as a spiritual category, because I was arguing against this idea in the first instant that mother are the super women. Mothers are women. I was arguing against that idea. That's why the title of the book is What Gender is Motherhood? And to complicate things further and to even alert you to it, my dissertation, which became Invention of Women, was titled Mothers Not Women. Because I have always understood from the word go, I actually wanted to write about motherhood as a way of responding to Western discourses about women are subordinated, women are nothing, nothing, nothing. And I said, in the first instance, the way I understood the society I was coming from, that one of the most important categories is mother. Important, you can't joke with your mother, you can't. In Yoruba, they always say, if your mother curses you, the curse will stick. But with your father, you can just say, oh, that's your problem, right? So we understood that. And so part of what I also do in What Gender is Motherhood then is to say that mother in the first instance is a spiritual category. All other things are secondary. And so, if mother is a spiritual category, I pointed out that you cannot talk about motherhood and fatherhood as on the one hand, on the other hand, as a binary. That mother is a spiritual category in a class by itself. I'm not saying fathers are not important because people, oh, father. No, I haven't said that. And then my issue is that when we talk about motherhood, why must we immediately talk about father? The reason we do that is that because theorizing, feminist theorizing, Western theorizing is actually based on the nuclear family, which is a Western type family, right? So that fatherhood is not the counterpart of motherhood, because the relationship, which is spiritual, between mother and child predates gestation, predates pregnancy. It's present in pregnancy, it's present after the baby is born, and it's present even after the mother has departed. Of course, people have a relationship with their father after the father is departed too. But the difference in the way in which fatherhood is conceptualized in Yoruba culture, and indeed spirituality, is that the relationship between father and child only happens after the baby is born. And so you do father-child relationship, they are not parallels in any way. And so Ori is the biggest concept. And another thing about Ori that is important is that precisely because of the relationship between mother and child, the Ori of the mother and child or children are conjoined. There's this notion that they are conjoined. And so if the Ori of the mother and a child is conjoined, the other siblings too. So we have these categories of children of the same mother. Dominde in Wolof. In one of my papers, I looked about 10 different West African societies where the category of mother and children is a special category and it's a spiritual category. And so when we're talking about spirituality, those are some of the issues that come to the fore. Thank you.
Bueno.
Todo lo que estabas comentando.
Thank you. All the topics you've raised make me think. You've made me think that in the Soninke people or populations, well, first of all, let me give you a little bit of background information about the Soninkes. I believe it is important to have this background information before we attempt to dig in and before I attempt to elaborate or to touch on what the doctor was raising. The Oninkes are a group of communities living in Western Africa. Some of us are in the diaspora, of course, and there's an historical traceability of our presence. You might have heard of concepts such as the Ghana or the Mali Imperium. So we were part of these empires, we were part of these communities. We used to live within these empires. In fact, the Yoninkes founded the Ghana Empire, and this is extremely important when it comes to raising the spirituality of our peoples and to discuss the topic you raised regarding other Western African communities. The Oninkes have gone through 3 processes. The first one, so our beliefs before the arrival of Islam, then the adoption of Islam. It is very important to raise this point, and colonization, of course. Colonization and all the resistance processes led by the population, or rather in Western Africa. I'm going to focus on Senegambia. Let me also give you a little bit of background information about Senegambia, because I don't dare speaking about the Soninges in all the territory of Western Africa, because we're quite dispersed. But again, it is very important to speak about these 3 moments in time. I'm going to go back and forth, probably, during my dissertation. I will speak about the past and the future, because it is also important to understand spirituality, to frame spirituality, to better understand the current situation of our peoples. The Soninques, before colonization, used to have what we said before, right? The Ghana Empire was founded by my predecessors, my direct predecessors. This I can reaffirm, and I feel proud about it, actually, about this event, this fact. There are narratives that other peoples hold dear, like the Mandingas, who speak about our spirituality even before the arrival of Islam. And even songs. There are songs, bed songs, that speak about this. And we really, really respect this spirituality. Even if we do not practice this spirituality anymore, or at least the majority of the Soninke population is Muslim, it is still very important to understand the social structure of the Soninkes, the way we perceive and read and interpret Islam, etc. So before colonization, the Soninkes used to practice pre-Islamic religions, African religions, with an important focus on spirituality and the veneration of predecessors. We wouldn't pray directly to our predecessors, we would pray to life, but we did pay tribute to that. Many of us believed in a supreme being, Vida, who was the personification of a white god of 7 heads. So this was Vida reflects the connection between the Soninkes and nature, and focus on important things in life, such as land, water, fertility, and Vida includes, of course, plenty of myths and histories. Even after adopting Islam or converting to Islam, this reading, this idea, this framework is very much present amongst many Soninke families. Now, after colonization, or before we get to the European colonization, I would like to speak about the arrival or adoption of Islam. When Islam arrived Western Africa, well, it was made possible due to the expansion of trade and previous interactions between populations from the region, especially because many of the Soninkes peoples who lived in the Sahel. By the way, I would like to question all these concepts such as trans-Saharan and many others. Well, I mean, we did have contact, but I deny the existence of this trans-Saharan idea. So despite having adopted Islam, well, in the case of the Soninkes, I believe there should be more research about how this happened, because a lot has been said about what happened with the Soninkes during the European colonization, but there is no written material about it, rather oral materials. If there's anything you don't get, please interrupt me as many times as needed. Islam is very important to understand our reality. Many of our population practices Islam, goes to the Mecca, and follows the 5 pillars of Islam. And likewise, many other communities in Western Africa. There are other social groups, such as the Mandinkas, whom after the fall of the Soninke Empire, after the fall of the Wagadu Empire, there's a Japateta. I am pretty sure many of you are acquainted with this image. He was Muslim, and he was a member of the board who wrote the first letter or Charter of Human Rights from an Islamic prism. And it is very important to raise this element because in my case, with other colleagues, we have been working to try and understand the impact of Islam in our communities. We have attempted to understand why the Soninke population embraced Islam when in fact they already had spiritual practices. Well, it's not, I mean, it's not incompatible, right, to adopt a religion, having a previous one. We're pretty special, even in Western Africa. We are considered to be special. We have a very peculiar history behind us. So I wouldn't dare saying we were a monotheistic group, but we wouldn't pay tribute to other deities. All the Soninkes would pay tribute to Eva. So I am not defending the Islam here, but I believe what I said helps understand the process. I know I'm speeding up, but let me now get to the mother of all evil, the European colonization. Everything was running smoothly until the Europeans set foot to bother to fuck around, to be honest. This is the word I'm thinking of using. So when the Europeans arrived, we realized, or they realized rather, that even if Islam was already widespread and part of the Soninke population and many Mande peoples were Muslim, so Europeans realized that spirituality was there. They realized when trying to impose a Christian approach, also anthropologists and sociologists had an important role in this process. Mea culpa, I'm a sociologist. I shouldn't say that, but it's true. So again, it is important to understand to what extent spirituality has played a very important role in resistance processes. Also, spirituality has been very important in understanding the relationships between women, the way culture and language has been disseminated. I know I am spoiling you the last block, but hey, spirituality is a key element to speak about language, to speak about many other topics. So after colonization, after the European colonization, so after the European colonization had kicked off, because of course it hasn't yet finished, one would say, colonizers would attempt to impose their way of life, and of course that includes their religion. There are references such as the Deithal, the Muri community in Senegal, who opposed openly who fought against colonization, and they did so also from a spiritual prisma. Many people fought colonization, pushed back colonization from a spiritual perspective. I believe that the main problem we are experiencing, the Soninkes, that is, well, even if Europeans colonized us, of course, from a spiritual perspective, they didn't really manage to wipe out our spirituality. But of course, colonization came in parallel with an homogenization process. The dystopia I'm most afraid of is us all saying things like brunch or eating McDonald's, McNuggets, or whatever. This is what really afraids me. Globalization is having an even worse impact in homogenization of spiritual practices than colonization did. Some of us are now rejecting Vida, even forms of resistance, such as Islam. I know what I'm saying is controversial and rather messy, so please do interrupt me at any given time. But hey, off I go until you do. I believe globalization is one of the major challenges in terms of spirituality in Western Africa. The homogeneity or the homogenization process of the Soninke population is rampant, and the rejection to one's own tradition or way of understanding syncretism, the syncretism between life, Islam, or even those who never that have always believed in God, right? It is a little bit complex to speak in Spanish right now because there's no word in Spanish to refer to some Soninke realities, how to refer to Islam from our cosmology, how we read Islam and Vida from our own cosmology. So I've attempted a really horrible translation, and for us, language is an impediment. Spanish, for example, is a problem. Spanish has a very binary structure. Soninkes, for example, well, vida has no gender. It's a snake with 7 heads, but with no gender. Many of our words are agendered, and spirituality is agendered. So when we have to translate our ideas and our cosmovision into Spanish, it is almost impossible, and it is important to understand that there is elements that are lost in translation. I know I am being extremely distracted, but it is complicated to be tidy and well structured to speak about this topic, and even more so in Spanish, which imposes again certain limitations in the expression of my cosmovision. So I really urge you to read about Soninke spirituality. There are many references, many local references in the context of Western Africa, such as Oyewùmi, who's spoken about the Wolof also. Diop, Hol, Kulibalit, Mimei Sissoko, Maria Masou, and Tamari. They are not Soninkes, but they have spent time there, and they are acquainted with culture. I'm going to hand it over to Marisol, because it is complicated to further elaborate on this. Thank you. And apologies for the poor pronunciation of the names.
Un poco en la línea de lo que planteabas, ¿no? O sea, en la...
So along the lines of what you were saying, in the work of the doctor, there's a part talking about language, and same thing happens in the Bubi culture. There are some words in Bubi that cannot be translated into Spanish. And it is true that hypothetically, there's a tension. This legacy is written by, Mayoko was saying before, after evangelization, Christianization, and missionaries. And what precedes comes from orality. This has also prevented us from doing the analysis, but when reading the book and also going deeper into Bubi culture matters, it is true that the doctor says that we should not generalize, but it's what we were saying before. The Yoruba culture has many things in common with the Bubi culture. And going back to colonization and the damage and prejudice it's meant when it comes to, especially in the case of Bubi culture for women, because as Mayoko was saying, the Bubi culture, the concept or the cosmology of the Bubi world is defined based on the set of people or group of people. And this Bubi world is also additionally defined based on different dimensions, and it's all in permanent movement. Bubi culture, in Bubi culture, we have the visible coexisting with the invisible, this live and dead interrelationship, and the interpretation given from the outside is like after colonization, How would I say this? Just to give you an example, the big, well, there's Visila, the great deity in the Bubi culture, and after colonization, she becomes the mother Visila. She's a virgin that all offers are given to, and she's worshipped from the church. Whereas before the colonization, one of the basic principles of the Bubi culture is that everyone comes from a common ancestor, which is a woman. Prior to colonization, families were organized by clans, and they lived in Lobao, in Bubi. I'm so sorry, but my pronunciation Bubi is not that great. But anyway, at any rate, but I'm sure it's better than 90% of people here. Yes, okay, thank you so much for that. Thank you for the effort, yes. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to be going up and down and fluctuating because you cannot imagine how difficult it is to convey this spirituality and the importance it has in spiritual terms, this power of woman in the Bubi culture. And more so when after the colonization, this was almost annihilated, our traditional cultures. So as I was saying, the organization of clans, well, these were families, these lobaos. I'm going to literally read because I don't want to make a mess of it all. And the information I share is from a book called Los Ritos de Paso Amongst Bubis. And any person interested in the Bubi culture should read this because everything is very well defined. And I was talking about this principle of matrilinearity, which is defined based on the Karichu. Karichu is a Bubi word, which is the basic unit of family relationships in Bubi. Everybody comes from an ancestor, a woman, who takes care of the descendants throughout the life, and this is also celebrated when they are going to die, so that they have a good trip back to the return, because I was saying we are in constant connection with all the different dimensions. Okay, so what it also stated was that in this organization, women used to be the owners of the land, and when colonization comes along, they are excluded, and there's also a bylaw or statute creating a new configuration, and women can no longer be owners of the land, and this happens to the patrilinear line, but women continue to be there having power. So this leads on to the fact that in the end, when we talk about matri-focus or matrilinearity, you say that you're a feminist, but there's always this doubt, yes? Women, in the end, make decisions, but given the history trajectory, we never have the power. But in the back of it all, we have women. In the Bubi culture, women have the power. As I was saying, as Doctor was saying, in Uri, it's Visila in the Bubi culture, and this transformation into a virgin means that, and I'm talking about my personal experience now, we spoke about the last presentation. When I go into my house, I am socialized as girl or woman, Bubi girl or woman. What does this mean to be? Bubi woman means to participate in the rites. So, how am I different to Jay? I am Bubi and she's not. If I want to get married and I follow my rituals and ceremonies, I need to have my partner come and ask for permission to my family, and there's a person in the mother line that needs to provide approval, just to give you an example. And I'm telling you that we could hold an entire seminar on this. But anyway, when we speak about combination or mixing and misgeneration, well, Bubi culture has its features, and it has a lot of connection with the land, with the earth. The Bubi culture is very much linked to life cycles, to seasons, to the rain, I don't know, the dry season as well. And here in a 3-bedroom apartment, I cannot go to the beach. I mean, I live in Madrid, and there's the rituals that are in January. I cannot go to the beach. There's a ritual of fertility, and that's in January, and I cannot go to the beach. So anyway, following tradition and culture, well, we're very much limited about territory and context, as the doctor was saying before. And also, continue being a booby. I want to continue being booby, but on the one hand, it's very difficult because when our parents, they reject their culture, and not voluntarily, but only because being booby here in Spain, the more Spanish you are, the better here in Spanish. Forget about booby. My mother said that in school they couldn't speak booby. My mother's around 60 now, and when she spoke booby in school, she was a collar was put on her, and she felt attacked. So imagine how she's transferring this culture to sons and daughters. As a daughter of a booby, I'm interested, of course, but this is being lost gradually. So a question here too is, how can we maintain our culture in the Spanish state? Because at the end of the day, we are less and less people who welcome and embrace our culture. It is true that one way of maintaining or keeping it is through community organizations, but indeed, it's very difficult in the end. As a daughter of booby, very much interested in culture as well, I see it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and we also have very little information on. Well, I think that young people are part of a generation in which everything needs to be explained. We need to be explained why to do things. And as compared to adults, perhaps, well, they say, well, tradition tells us that we have to do this. If you're a booby, you need to do this. And the answer is, okay, but why? My mother can't explain many of the things. And if I don't know why I'm going to do something, or I have to do something, I don't do it. I stop doing it, and it gets lost. And what happens with culture? Because in the end, these are all questions and reflections I'm concerned about, because we get the feeling that the culture is going to be lost, and I don't want to stop being a booby. I have my booby flag, of course, but perhaps I won't know about the rituals tomorrow or in the future. I don't know how to practice the rituals. I know I'm beating around the bush. Totally. I know I was going to talk about something different. I also wanted to share that, amongst other things, colonization in the booby culture also causes that, apart from our deities that end up becoming virgins and Christian matters, because at the end of the day, rituals, where we used to have some offers going to the beach, now we just give mass for this or that instead of an offering. Everything is Christianized. And also in this new stage, with these new dynamics of relationship, those who have the powers are priests. The botuku and the chief, or the person recognized with power, now we don't have that anymore. We have priests. Everything acquires this, I don't know, sort of a darkish tint or dye. Anyway, and also we spoke about this transfer of women. The clan is reproduced through the women. This is also a hypothesis that perhaps after colonization, the reading made is, hey, no, but women are perpetuating the clan through childbirth. It's like booby women are also only good to be mothers. Booby women who are not mothers are pointed at in our culture. And finally, this reading from this reproductive capacity is, well, our individuality is attacked, and we are attributed more characteristics, like almost like making us or turning us into animals. We're only good for this, and once again we are dehumanized. And it seems like we're no longer women. We're just here to procreate, and from this capitalist logics to just obtain benefit. I've gone and come back. That's what I wanted to say. But anyway, as we were saying, in our culture, there are many rituals that are also linked to these passing rituals. Just to give you another example, this is another hypothesis. After the colonization, there's different deities amongst the Bubi people, and after the colonization, they are equally engenerized, and then all of a sudden we have male spirits and female spirits defined based on characteristics. So the kindest and more relaxed are women, and those with more strength, it's like the gender mandates from this Western conception. But from Bubi culture, life is transmitted through the blood of the mother. That's the element on which the link and the belonging to the Carichu. You're looking at me as if, stop now, stop here, or no, you're doing fine. No, we're not doing fine. We're not doing fine. Okay. Okay, I think I'm getting to the end of it. No, please do. I also wanted to say that children cannot. Children are identified with the group of the mother, and they are members of the clan, the Carichuba, or the mother. And these children, male children, cannot. It's all the mother, okay? Women and our ancestors, female ancestors. And in this relationship, there's the dimension of the invisible, of the visible and invisible. The invisible coexists with us at all times. We also worship these different dimensions, the different spheres, and as opposed to Western culture where everything is static, in the Bubi culture everything is dynamic. Okay, and so far so good. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you so much, everybody. I know it is super difficult to try and summarize, to try and translate for us and retranslate for us constantly. But I'm very grateful for the effort, even though I'm glancing at you sideways, but that's the role I have here today. I'm so sorry. So that we can all continue opening up the conversation. It's now 7:12. We started slightly later than what we should have. So we don't have a lot of time in this block. I would like, if someone has a question, any short question, please. Short? Is it short? Go ahead. I don't know where the microphone is. Please, over here.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Sí, yo me voy a ubicar también. Yo comparto con Marisol nuestra herencia cultural.
I share our cultural inheritance with Marisol. I'm also a Bubi woman, and it resonated a lot when the doctor spoke about Ori, because it is true that the Bubi and Yoruba culture have very similarities, many similarities. And when you were talking about Ori, I heard what Marisol said. One is not but in the community, and the Airibo figure. This figure, if Carichobo is your community spirit or those guarding your family and house, the Wairibo is indeed that spirit that protects you individually. So you always have this correspondence. It's like a guarding angel, yes, is that element you give offerings to. It needs to materialize or do the hand imposition, the rites or ritual that is done by a woman in your family, always in your motherline, and it resonated a lot, I have to say. But what I wanted to say as well is how somehow when you were speaking about how to keep being Yoruba or keep being Bubi in diaspora, in the Western world, with all the different impediments that the pace of life or the lifestyle is imposing on us, it made me think of how the concept of spirituality in the Western world is more a belief than part of our life and of our day-to-day and social organization and community organization. This is just a belief that you somehow choose to have or not to have. And from a materialistic perspective, it's frequently difficult to articulate, and now I'm taking this over to my own space, but to articulate in the political sphere in that way of existence that the Western world does not have, because they basically have primitive accumulation of capital, and that erasing of that primitive accumulation through the prosecution of witches and eliminating the relationship of the original peoples with the land to profanate land and the bodies of women and to violate all that. So anyway, that gap, that breaking away robbed the original people from their spirituality in the Western world. So it's a difficulty. There's a difficulty when it comes to discussing and being able to understand each other, because there's that space in existence that is not shared. So frequently, this, in the end, boils down to adding up to this violence, this underestimation, belittling of our perspectives and our contributions that do include this dimension, because this dimension is also part of our identity, our African nature, and the way we exist, and the way we propose and project in our day-to-day, our family activities, family social activities. It is a significant role. So how, in the end, this non-existence of spirituality in the Western culture entails a problem when it comes to not just coexisting, but also the political articulation to defend our collective rights, community rights, etc., etc. There is an almost impossible translation there, and this leads on to an additional layer or excuse to violate our existence in the diaspora.
Gracias, Basha.
Thank you, Basha. Anyone else wanting to add something? Just a very short reflection.
Esta cuestión de la espiritualidad me mueve mucho porque efectivamente
subject of spirituality, it really moves me because it goes beyond, far beyond how it's conceived in the Western world as something individual or individualized, or as a choice, as a personal choice that you make. I'm very much interested, but I'm also in this role of moderator today, and you know, I said to, and there was somebody else over there. Okay, are you going to be short and brief? Okay, at the back. So here first, there's two comments here, but please, very, very short interventions and contributions. Let's try and close this block in 10 minutes max. Yes, I promise I'm going to be very brief. No, I'm saying 10 minutes for everyone left to speak. Yes, I cannot, but when I think about spirituality, I think that I am in a negative cloud here today, and I'm going to spoil it all for you with Islamophobia now, not only because of the Western framework, but also because of the Christian-centric framework. It prevents from people who do not fall in the canon can have a dignified spiritual life. If I start remembering my own personal experience, I'm an also Soninke. She's my cousin, in fact, I had to say. Sorry. And in our family, if you are Soninke at birth, you are going to be told you are Soninke and you're a Muslim, for starters. The fact of being here in Spain and the trauma it entails, not just in terms of racism, but Islamophobia as well, the fact that you have police officers observing and surveying your mosque constantly, and the fact that even because of the blackness, your spirituality is dehumanized, and how you dress is made exotic or not, and all this is really uncomfortable. In fact, when you speak to people in our parents' generations, they are very concerned about the crisis of identity in the Soninkés people and sons and daughters of immigrants, how we are drifting away from spirituality, and how spirituality brings you close to your family and your community, and how Islamophobia is marking the spiritual life not only of Soninkés but any person in the Muslim world with a Mande experience. That is to say that we share the same ethnical root. The fact is that I would like to at least bring Islamophobia into the matter, especially because of the increase of hate currently in the Western world, and how, when we want to speak about that, Islamophobia specifically, it is so complex and so violent. And when we also speak about other forms of Islamophobia that are very visible, such as the case of the population coming from the north of Africa, how even when that violence is not recognized, you are condemned to oblivion, for starters, and you're condemned and sentenced to having to exercise your spirituality hidden, in a hidden way, as if you were, well, not just in a marginal way, but from a social ostracism that is like not dignified. It's not something dignified to live and be seen as a Muslim. And not just that, but currently with all the different Islamophobic state policies that survey the spiritual life of Muslims, the fact of not having access and not being able to pray 5 times a day, or having the Ramadan in a dignified way, and even speaking about Allah without being looked at as a terrorist. Not being able to balance that spirituality, because when oftentimes we want to talk about the roots, our spiritual roots, or at least before the arrival of Islam, it's like that mentioning a vida is much more dignified than what we're living now, and how that present moment is violated in the day-to-day life and also in your family. Because I think about my parents, especially my father, who is a man who dresses in an African style with his beard, and my mother with a hijab and everything, how they're criminalized. And the fact that I'm not wearing a hijab now, but it's like a passing. And when you speak to Black Muslim women, that fine line of when the scarf is considered a hijab and when it's not, and when that spiritual identity is even taken away from you. I believe it's important to bring this to the table.
I'm not so sure how to bundle what I was thinking or feeling up as a question, but when you had spoken about, well, Ifa divination and Ori, and that this previous way of existing in Yoruba society before it was colonialized and gendered, how this was resonating with a lot of trans people that were coming, I guess, to you, and how this was maybe something they were feeling comfortable with or identifying with. I was wondering whether you yourself would advocate for this type of spirituality to be seen as a way to be able to release ourselves from this embrace with the West, as you had kind of described in your book also. And if in that it's more a descriptive model, as like, this is how things were, this is how things could be, this could be used as an inspiration, or if you are actually welcoming and like inviting, let's say, non-Yoruba but queer people into this discourse, because the reality of it, I guess, is still that many queer people would not really find space within Yoruba society, coming from a non-binary person of Yoruba descent, and that a genderless society is not necessarily a queer society. Then at the same time, we have all these issues going on with the commercialization of especially African spirituality, of voodoo, of all these things that kind of contribute again to just extracting things from African soil and using it within a Western discourse. And I was just kind of wondering how to balance that, how to be open and inviting, and the way that you were, for example, explaining the things about destiny and how this can, of course, apply to anyone, regardless of whether you're Yoruba or not, queer or not. But at the same time, I'm like, I mean, the reality of the matter is that it is still an environment that would be hostile to queer people, although it is genderless. And so I don't know. I was just kind of how to balance these things. I was wondering.
Well, very good question. And when one is talking about these matters, when I'm talking about Ori and Ifa, these things are not passé. People still now go to their babalawo and still do this and still do that. And Brazil presents a very interesting case. And before I ever went to Brazil, and now I've been to Bahia several times, I even went for consultation with Babalawo in Bahia, right? Before I ever went to Brazil, one of the things I read in some of the literature, and I also met Brazilians and people doing research, they always talked about the fact that in Brazil, it seemed as if Yoruba spirituality was more open to queerness and homosexuality. Because many of the practitioners in Brazil, in Bahia, there seemed to be more openness to that. And last Christmas, I went to Cotonou, Republic of Benin. around when they were doing the Vodun festival. And then, of course, in West Africa, Vodun and Yoruba spirituality were not really separate things. You saw a lot of men who were gay openly in the spirituality. So the question has always been, what about Yoruba spirituality makes for more openness to different kinds of sexuality? Is that an old story, or is it about now? Which is I think it's a very good question. And I don't want my talk about Ori and motherhood to give the impression that when you go to Yoruba land today, everybody is talking about Yoruba spirituality. People practice, but first and foremost, they say, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim. Because in Yoruba land, we probably have Christians and Muslims half and half. So it's, in certain ways, I always say Yoruba society is a society that has been assaulted by the two Abrahamic religions. And sometimes they are in contention. And that has a lot of effect on the indigenous spirituality. But yet, as people identify with these so-called world religions, Yoruba spirituality, the spirituality is still there. You can still go to your Babalawo, and people are constantly, many are demonizing the spirituality. So there's no doubt that today a whole lot of that is going on. However, as a scholar of Yoruba society, and indeed, I think that what my work brings to the table is to introduce a different way of seeing things that in the Yoruba space. Probably because we always say Yorubas, we have 401 deities and still counting. That's about proliferation. That's about muchness. And then, interestingly enough, I also feel that the concept of Ori opens things up and allows for people to be their individual self. For example, if you go to an Ifa diviner, we have this whole divining. It was part of everyday life. You go to the diviner whenever you want to make big decisions, small decisions, and they divine for you. One of the things that came to the fore is that in Ifa divination, they always say there is nothing that happens to a human being that is outside of Ifa. You cannot go to the diviner and say, oh, I have this problem. Can you look into it? And then the diviner says, oh, no, nobody has ever seen this problem. Ifa divination responds on the basis of precedents. So if you have a problem and you go to the diviner that, I have this problem, can you look into it? How can we solve it? They will find an example in the past of something like that having happened to somebody else. So you are never outside of Ifa. So think about it. If as a parent, you come to the Babalawo one day and say, you know, I have a son and I found him in bed with his best friend, right? A gay relationship. And you go and report to the Babalawo. That the Babalawo cannot say, I'm just shocked. the Babalawo will come up with a model about, well, when certain things happen to certain people 1,000 years ago, this was what they did. All this to say that when you go to Ifa, the Babalawo might say something like, this person is doing this, behaving in this way. You cannot stop this person from behaving in that way because you don't know what his or her Ori is telling her. So Ori becomes a kind of shield for you to express yourself. And I'm beginning to think that whether it's in Brazil or whether it's in Yoruba land, that maybe that's where that flexibility comes, because there's nothing that happens to you that is not part of the human experience. You are not dehumanized because that thing has happened before. What we just have to understand is, how are you going to express it? How are you going to live it? So I think that we go back to Ori and what Ori allows for people to express themselves. Okay?
Había antes una cuestión más que no.
I think there was another question or comment that we skipped. Is it a question? Yes. Very short. We ask it and we close with this. And we have a 10-minute break. Okay, it will be 10 minutes. And then we come back, resume, and we go back to it.
Yeah, thank you for everything that's been brought to the space. I'm really curious about Ori in the sense of, is it specific to every life, or is it the same Ori for all lives, or how does it work in the long term? And I have many other questions, but I'll leave it with that one. The second one, I'm going to try and formulate this in a way that it makes sense. I have a very complicated relationship with my mother. Part of the story is I grew up in the UK, but my family is as German as they come. And so within that relationship, there's always been a rejection of different cultural inputs. And probably over the course of this year, I have understood and connected both to the motherly love that's there, and at the same time how my mother completely embodies patriarchal, capitalist, colonialist values in our relationship and how we destroy each other through fighting on those lines. And I really like this idea or this difference that you made between what is embodied and what comes on the spiritual level, for want of a better word. It helps me to understand a lot of what's been going on. My question to you and also to others here is, I guess one of the ways I've been thinking this is that we carry both female and male as part of our bodying. That also comes through my time of living in Gabon with a group called the Baka, Egalitarian Hunter-Gatherers, for a year. That we carry these different qualities and energies within. And I'm curious how in these different cultural contexts that we've been naming, whether that duality as part of one bodying exists, or whether, and this is what I'm starting to think, listening, that is also actually a partly Western concept. Again, Western in brackets, knowing it's also not a very perfect word. Thank you.
The only one I can quickly respond to is that each and everybody have their own Ori. And literally, Ori means head. Your head is your head, but it's the inner head is the destiny you carry, meaning what you chose before you come to earth. And so in Yoruba, people understand that whatever happens to you is because you chose it. And you see this when there's a tragedy, somebody dies young, they say, that's what this person chose. Okay? So each person have their own Ori. And then the whole essence of my work is that kind of duality and binarism that you're talking about is absent in Yoruba. That whole idea that you have male energy, female energy, I don't think we would talk about it in that way.
Hacemos ahora una pausa.
Right, so little break now. Yes, let's say it's 7:40, so at 7:50 sharp we come, and the last block will be much shorter, of course.
Bueno. Bueno, nos hemos pasado del tiempo, vamos.
Okay, we have gone over our time. We're doing terrible with time, but I think we're also enjoying it, aren't we? We have 35 minutes left, and all the last...
En el que íbamos, ¿no? Bueno, seguramente a seguir profundizando y a seguir trayendo...
And continuing to... with everything we started 3 hours ago now, or more than 3 hours ago. I've lost track of time. Anyway, this last and final block, we thought of it as a block where we could discuss some of the fundamental concepts of the Yoruba society and culture, brought to us by Dr. Oyewùmi in this book on the invention of women, and that is the sense of the world. The West has always privileged sight as a way of knowing. We saw this in the first part of this seminar, to such an extent that we use concepts like cosmovision, right? It's quite usual to refer to cosmovision when we use our language in Spanish, and I don't think it's exclusive to Spanish or to our languages of Latin origin. So to look at, when we talk about cosmovision, to try and understand or to talk about how we understand or what is the sense we make of this world we live in. But there are other cultural systems like the Yoruba system that do not privilege sight or vision. Vision wouldn't be the prioritized sense, and that is why Dr. Oyewùmi is talking to us about the sense of the world to describe the sense of the world seen through non-Western cultures, and more specifically the Yoruba culture. I'd love it if we could think about the sense of the world that we envisage when we look from our different communities. I mean, before the break, when Dr. Oyewùmi Oyewùmi arrived, before starting and kicking off this seminar, we had some time to chat, and we were talking about the issue of senses and using all 5 senses. The 5 senses that we have in the Western culture are the ones that are privileged in the Western culture, and they're not really interrelated in the Western culture, and how this, for many of us, works differently. There are not only 5 senses, there is not one single dimension, and also senses are interconnected. So, based on all of this, I thought it would be good if we could have a conversation on what are the senses of the world we are building in our different communities, and also from the Afro-diaspora communities, in the sense that are we trying to bring one sense of the world or another in our Afro-diaspora communities. I would also like it if we could revisit, based on the sense of the world, if we could revisit the way in which we understand the social structures we live in this physical space where we are here this evening, not just the physical space, but also how this symbolical space is set up, this European symbolical space, the state of Spain or the region of Catalonia more specifically. There are some epistemological proposals, and I'll be brief, ranging from Afrocentric views, or some other epistemologies, and here again we're trying to distinguish, as we were saying before, some back epistemologies, but then what I see as the Afro-diaspora epistemologies we use oral tradition, the memory of sounds, to shape these new senses of the world. And what I'd like to put across to you now is my sister Iki departed. She had to leave. She was here sitting in the room for most of the afternoon, but together we worked on a experimental black thinking, black thought laboratory, and we were working with thought methodologies that do not necessarily go through the brain, or where the brain isn't the main organ for thought. We did a lot of work. Our work is mostly through oral accounts and through the memory of sounds, or memories of those sounds that carry us back to these other realities on the African continent, and that connect us to our realities on the African continent, that connect us to that diaspora memories. So I'd love it if we could think along these lines about the issue of the senses of the world, with this oral tradition, which curiously I'm losing my voice now, but from these other places that maybe have been looked down upon in the Western society and culture, but that are different cultural traditions, give a great meaning to. it makes sense to connect the senses, and it goes beyond those senses that we are used to talk about. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll give the floor to whoever of the three would like to take the floor. I know we're probably feeling a bit tired by now, but if anyone wants to break the ice, of course, Dr. Oyewùmi, if you'd like to start, that's fine.
Okay, but it may not be long, short. I was just telling you, when we were having the discussion, because when I was writing that section of the invention of women, I was thinking about the senses. Of course, I went into it with this notion of 5 senses, right? I'm a westernized, colonized, And then I started to think about it. Sorry. So when I started to think about the senses as I was writing the invention of women, I went into it knowing that there are 5 senses, right? Because of my education, my colonized. And I think part of what advantage the West has given itself by colonizing our brain is that, they've discovered the holy grail of human existence. All we have to do is. But as I started thinking about it, even in terms of our everyday language, I said, Yorubas are not thinking of senses in exactly that same way. And the most immediate thing that came to my mind, and any Yoruba-speaking person will know this, is just everyday language. When somebody is cooking and you pass by the kitchen, you say, I can hear the smell of your food. That was the first thing. I said, wow. Okay, if Yoruba say, I can hear the smell of your food. What does it say about that whole 5 senses paradigm? It immediately talks about the linkages between these different, right? So that was one first thing that came to my mind. And another thing that's just come to my mind now is that in the Western tradition, there's this thing called the 6th sense, right? Let's have it in Spanish too, right? So suppose we start thinking of our experiences from the 6th sense rather than the vision. And I also say that, and I don't know whether in terms of my own personal experience, I have 3 children. And I learned from my mother and everybody around about the special relationship that some of which I've been discussing between at least babies and their mothers when they are babies. And one of my experiences, and I don't know whether it has been talked about in the scientific literature, I know that when I was growing up, I'll hear some women with young babies, and maybe somebody has taken their baby somewhere or whatever. Then they suddenly say, my baby's crying. I can feel it in the breast. I felt that too. Am I making this up? No. So how does one know? The breast know. And then, of course, there's a whole larger sense that sometimes some people say, if something has happened to my child, I would know. I think it's related to that. But probably as we get older and the child gets older, that Thai phrase. But when I had small babies, I took it for granted. I've never theorized it, but it's like, okay. So there's some sense there. And so we need to be able to apprehend the world, even in Barcelona, from the sixth sense, and see what it yields. So I'll leave it at that and leave it to my sisters here.
Es que estoy buscando una frase que tenía aquí que no la encuentro, que quería...
I was looking for a sentence here that I wanted to share with you. I can't find it now. Anyway, it is true that from everything we've shared, I'd like to go back to our sister's intervention before. And I think the sense of the world, for me, means to bring a new meaning into orality. We've talked a lot about how orality has been a way of conveying knowledge or not, and maybe that has stopped us from having more written content than we would like. And in this regard, based on the memories of sound, going back to my own personal story, I feel that when I enter my home and I look at myself as a booby girl or woman, instinctively I'm a booby woman. But if I think of the way in which we relate to one another and the issue of the meaning of songs, at the end of the day, all of those symbolic elements, we've traditionally paid very little attention to everything that is symbolic. So maybe we need a shift in paradigm. And when looking at these new methodologies, we should include new dimensions and new categories, stepping away from everything that is binary and bringing in new dimensions. The sentence I was looking for was that we should use our bodies as a work of art to bring in new perspectives so that we don't remain stuck with a feeling of rage or anger. This is to say that emotions, it's like black women have repressed their feelings and emotions. And going back to a mention that was made of mental health before, I'd like to go back to emotions. There's an emotional dimension and we must use it in our favor. And I'll leave it at that too. Thank you so much, Marisol. There's one short thing with what you just mentioned about looking for new methodologies. They're not new. Of course. No, let me take those words back. No, I mean, it's important because we always like to say that we are reinventing the wheel for everything. But they're not new. The oral transmission of knowledge or the memory of sounds or food, no? As you were talking, I was thinking about my colleagues at the Madrid Negro lab. Some months back, they had an event called Móstoles, which is a neighborhood in Madrid, Móstoles Negro, Black Móstoles. And for that event, they asked me to prepare a piece referring to what it was like to grow up in a town with 300,000 inhabitants. It is a town, it's not a city really. That town is Móstoles. And I told them about how important it is, or how important for me the memories of food is, and the few times where we got together with my Combe family to share a meal. But they'd been very important moments for me, and how important food is in those social gatherings, and how I, as an adult person who meets my Combe culture, once again, I was doing so. Well, it wasn't always with my family, it could be with my family or without, but I was reconnecting through food, because food brought back all those memories of, this social event. And in this regards, talking about senses of the world, we can use other senses such as taste. It's not just taste, it's our soul, how this connects to our emotions. Sorry, I didn't want to take over, but going back to what you were saying before, Marisol, referring to those new methodologies, they're never new. We are always recovering things that we were told was not knowledge. Everything that we were told were other things, that they were not truly knowledge, that knowledge was found elsewhere. So I think we should precisely give due importance to all those things that we've been told are not knowledge and that are deeply African. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm really tired at this point, but when you were talking about taste, for the Solinke, I'd say taste is really important. How could I translate this? We call it jonle. Jonle would be, it's like a pumpkin or a squash that you dry out under the sun, and people then use it in their daily lives. And this made me think, because, obviously food is linked to our life cycle. Jonle is used as food, but in the jonle is also strongly connected to mothers and to passing down culture to their daughters. Jonle is a symbol of this. When a Soninke baby is born, the first bath given to that baby, the water is poured into the jonle and they bathe the baby in the empty jonle. So when you marry, you use the jonle as a symbol that you are given a jonle so that you can sell sombi, which is like a rice pudding dessert. This is my own free translation here, but jaragame, which is also part of the pumpkin. And I think in many African cultures it is also used. I don't know, Dr. Oyewùmi, whether you also use these giant pumpkins in the Yoruba people or not. I'm not sure. Pumpkins or squash. The jonle is a symbol for food, and it's also something that is with you throughout your life, and it's a tool to convey knowledge. And when you die, you pass on your jonle to the next generation. I remember my mum wasn't able to be at her mum's funeral, and then when my uncle came back from the funeral, they said, your sisters have asked me to give you my jonle. So my grandmother, usually the grandmother gives the jonle to the eldest sister, but as my mum was far away in the diaspora, the grandmother asked my uncle to give the jonle to my mum. And she made jonles for my sister and I. I have a twin sister, and our grandmother made jonles for us before she died, and we've kept them. And when I leave this world, this jonle will go to my daughters if I have kids. If not, to maybe a niece or God knows. I don't know what I'll do with the jonle if I don't have kids. But you can pass it down from one generation to another. It's a symbol. It's a vehicle that connects you to the Soninke, and it's that bond here is through food. I'm not excluding men in all of this, of course, but the honle is closely related to the first times when you are taught to cook. Your mom pours the rice in the honle